3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this, our latest Saints Talk live from St Andrews. My name's Alex Hayes. I'm Head of Development for Arts and Divinity at the University, and our talk today on employee surveillance will be given by Professor Kirstie Ball from the School of Management. Kirstie joined the school in 2016, having held positions at Aston, Warwick, Birmingham, and the Open Universities. She's Professor in Management and co-director and founder of the Centre for Research into Information, Surveillance and Privacy, or CRISP, a joint research centre between St Andrews, Edinburgh, Stirling and Essex universities. She is also Research Fellow at the Surveillance Studies Centre, Queen's University, Canada, and Visiting Professor at the Centre for Business in Society at Coventry University. In 2015, Kirstie published The Private Security State, Surveillance, Consumer Data and the War on Terror, which was the first empirical study from an organisational perspective of private sector involvement in government surveillance regimes. She's also co-editor of a Routledge book series entitled Studies in Surveillance, and she edited the Routledge Handbook of Surveillance Studies, a key resource for those who teach about surveillance. She is consulted to the UK's Information Commissioner, authoring a report on the Surveillance Society in 2006, which prompted 2 parliamentary committee inquiries and its follow-up in 2010. Kirstie's also co-founded and co-edited the journal Surveillance and Society and the charitable company Surveillance Studies Network, an educational charity which supports the journal. She's advised numerous NGOs, research funding bodies and news media organisations about surveillance, privacy and security. She frequently appears in the broadcast and print media and at public events to speak about surveillance as a contemporary social phenomenon. Most recently, you may have seen Kirstie contributed to an Institute for Public Policy Research report into workplace surveillance, which was covered in The Observer this weekend with the headline, "Dystopian Surveillance Disproportionately Targets Young Female and Minority Workers." Kirstie will speak for around 35 minutes, after which you will have the opportunity to ask her questions. Please do take that opportunity, and you can submit your questions into the chat at any point, either during or after the talk. We'll wrap up promptly at 6:15. So now, to tell us whether we are indeed entering a new era of workplace efficiency or perhaps a dystopian nightmare, or maybe a bit of both, please welcome Professor Kirstie Ball. Kirstie.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks so much for the introduction. And thanks also to the university for inviting me to do this Saints Talk. And special thanks to Ram, who's doing all the technology link up again this evening. So yeah, so I'm actually here to talk about my favourite topic. Now, Alex just gave a really interesting introduction about the things that I've done over the last few years, which were more around the surveillance and privacy and security area. But actually, my favourite topic running through the whole of my research career is workplace surveillance. I did my PhD on it in the mid-90s. I've stayed in and around that topic probably for the last 25 years or so. And of those 25 years, the first 20 have actually been really quite quiet. So there was me and maybe 3 or 4 other people around the world who would occasionally talk to each other about workplace surveillance. But now the topic's got really, really popular, like emphasised by the IPPR report that's just come out. And we've had more published in the last 10 years on workplace surveillance than in the preceding 30, largely because in the preceding 30 it was me and a few other people. But it's really prevalent now, and it's really something that's in the zeitgeist at the moment, probably for 2 reasons. The first reason is that there has been a general increase in surveillance of workers because of a thing called workplace datafication. So the work that we do now is often mediated on digital platforms. We use digital devices, we maybe carry those with us, we wear them. There's biometric technology which can interpret our facial expressions, our sentiments and so on. And this has given rise to bigger propensity to actually monitor those data trails that people create as they work. But also there's been the pandemic, and what the pandemic involved was a vast proportion of people having to work from home and a crisis of management control over exactly how they should manage those people working in their homes. So there was a rush and a kind of a steady creep towards more intensified workplace surveillance. There's actually a 40-year body of knowledge about how to minimise the risks to employees of excessive surveillance while they work, but we still see sometimes these excesses of surveillance in organisations as managers perhaps become seduced by the potential insights of employee monitoring and people analytics and what those may offer, and maybe overlook the known harms. So what I'm going to talk about this evening is research on those known harms and how we may approach workplace surveillance in a more principled way. And in doing that, I'm going to draw on a report I wrote for the European Commission in 2021 about workplace monitoring and surveillance, kind of in the light of its intensification in recent years. So here is the structure of my talk this evening. The first thing I'm going to do is actually try to myth bust some of our perhaps common tropes about surveillance. I'm going to suggest that surveillance is all about being modern, so rather than it being about Big Brother, and I'll talk about that in a second. Then I'm going to talk about risk. So what are the risks that we know about so far associated with workplace surveillance? I'm then going to talk about well-being, because there are some health and safety at work implications of some of these risks, and there are also wider business implications that I want to talk about. Then I'll introduce my principled approach, and finally tell you what's happening at the moment in the policy world around workplace surveillance. So let's crack on with that and talk about how surveillance is part of being modern. Now, what you can see on the slide there are two pictures, but before I go into the pictures, I'm going to start with a definition, which will start to sort of neutralise some of our perhaps, visceral, maybe scared reactions to surveillance. And I always draw on David Lyon's definition, which goes like this. It says, surveillance is any processing of data, whether personally identifiable or not, for the purposes of influencing or managing those whose data have been garnered. And there's two things going on in this definition. The first is that surveillance always involves the analysis of information. We're gathering information about a population, we're analysing it, and then we're trying to influence that population with what we know about them. So that's an exercise of power. So gathering and use of information and an exercise of power. And in the workplace, that could be something like a call centre manager telling a worker based on their statistics what they need to do next, how they need to improve, how they need to develop. Or it could be something like a recruitment consultant using machine learning to search through the language used in CVs in order to shortlist a person for interview. What's really interesting about surveillance is that none of this, obviously the technology is new, but none of the actual process of surveillance is particularly new. It's something that's always been a part of society, but with the electronic digital side of it, the data collection and analysis, it's a lot more powerful, and it's also a lot less visible. It's less transparent to the outsider. So that starts to raise questions about surveillance. So I'll move on to that in a second. But for me, I'm an organisation theorist, I always have been, and it's useful to think of surveillance as a modern organising principle. It's not always about evil, it's not always about Big Brother and malign forces. It's actually a way of getting things done. It's a way in which society is organised along the use of information to gain and exercise influence and power. And surveillance as we know it today actually has its roots in the birth of modern organisations, the birth of the modern bureaucracy, among other things. And those other things are things like the census and population control, and also military innovation. But there are two sites which are important when it comes to understanding why surveillance processes became such an important part of modern organising. And I'm now going to turn to the two pictures on the slide. So the first picture is on the left-hand side of the slide, and what you can see there is a picture of a train wreck, and it's quite clear you've got two locomotives that have hit each other head on and had a terrible crash. And in 1841, this was the Western Railroad disaster, and it was one of the worst railway accidents in North America at the time. Now, what's interesting here is how the railway responded to it. In 1841, the telegraph was invented, maybe 1841 or two. The telegraph was invented. And what the railway companies did was they laid telegraph lines alongside of the tracks. And by doing this, they could tell where the trains were on the tracks at any one time. They could tell, they could create things like timetables. They could internalize that information, start to organize better, become more efficient. Watches could be synchronized across the railway network. So the whole thing was much safer and prevented accidents. Now, what was happening here organisationally, and there's the organisational historian James Benninger writes about this and tells us this, was that the organisation was improving its performance by internalising information about its operations and building a more efficient operation because of that information that they internalised. And what happened in the railways, unfortunately, was they grew and grew and grew, and then costs began to spiral out of control. And what did they then start to do? They started to gather information about who might be the culprit of these inefficiencies and started to clamp down on the railway workers themselves. And this is kind of accompanied with these sort of Victorian moralizations about dereliction of duty and terrible irresponsibilities that these workers were these workers were doing, and all reported on using this telegraph. If we move back across the Atlantic, we see another picture on the right hand side here that's an aerial photograph of a place called Saltaire, which is in Bradford in West Yorkshire. Now, Saltaire was a village built around a factory by an industrialist whose name was Titus Salt. And he was a real person. He was not a character in a Dickens novel. He was genuinely an actual person, and he built this, Saltaire. Now, what you can see around Saltaire is the factory itself where the workers work, but what Titus Salt could see at the time was horrible deprivation and slums in the northern cities of England. And he wanted to build a village around his factory so that people could live in a safe way, in a healthy way, and come to work healthy and ready to work. But what he did was build an architecture of surveillance around his factory. So if you look at that picture there, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see tiny rows of terraced houses and a larger house on the end, and then a larger house next to that. And those tiny terraced houses was for the workers. The house on the end was for the supervisor. The bigger house next to that was for the manager. And so everyone was watching and governing the behaviour of their workers both inside and outside the workplace around things like temperance and the Lord's Day and Sunday and all that kind of thing. So what we see here again is this idea of surveillance, both in terms of information and behaviour, growing with the developments in modern organising. So what we can say then, generally speaking, in organisations nowadays, employee surveillance facilitates elements of the employment contract. So it lets employers know who's doing what and when, and lets employees know how well they're doing, all in theory. And there are legitimate interests why employers need to collect data about what their staff are doing. The first thing, and I've probably illustrated that already, is to ensure that resources are used efficiently. The second reason is to protect commercial confidentiality and manage risk in the workplace because of commercial secrets and so on. And finally, to ensure that laws are complied with, so because we don't want people committing crimes on company property. That's why we would monitor people or surveil people in the workplace. But what's happening nowadays? So let me just move forward in my slide here. What's new in workplace surveillance? So I alluded to two of these things at the beginning of my talk. What we've had probably in the last 5 years is this increase in workplace datafication. And so we have organisations like Gartner who always do these kind of big surveys about tech and how it's used. Whoops, pardon me. Sorry, there we go. And they found in a 2019 survey, so this is before the pandemic, remember, so there's 50% of employers they surveyed used what they call non-traditional employee tracking. And this basically means not just using performance statistics and outputs as a measure of what people do in their work, but also doing things like analysing the text of emails and social media messages for sentiment analysis to understand employee sentiment, to scrutinise who's meeting with whom by doing employee network analysis, gathering biometric data, for example, facial recognition to indicate stress, or to give access to buildings, and maybe to try and understand how employees are utilising their workspace. So non-traditional employee monitoring is on the rise. And they also, if we move across to the pandemic, now if you cast your mind back to March 2020, if you can do so without being massively triggered and freaked out and everything, if you cast your mind back to March 2020, what happened was everyone had to go work from home, or like something like 60% of the workforce, 70% had to go and work from home. And there was a crisis of management control. Managers were like, oh my gosh, how are we going to kind of make sure everyone's doing their job, and everyone's at home in a complete panic in the middle of a pandemic. And what we saw in Google searches, this is quite well cited, is that searches for how to monitor employees working from home increased by 1,705% in April 2020, and then again 652% in May 2020 when they compared with the previous year. And some of this fed through in some of the TUC started to survey workers and said, well, okay, we are feeling an increase in surveillance, like 1 in 7 workers definitely experienced that and reported that to the TUC. So the current picture really is that we have a wider range of technologies being used in the workplace, which enables surveillance to extend beyond things like performance management and into some of the more personal areas about what people are doing in the workplace. So their thoughts, their feelings, their behaviours, their location and movement, and also their professional reputation. And that's a direct quote from the report that I wrote in 2021. So this is where it starts to maybe get a little bit worrying. We start to think, okay, well, this could be perceived as intrusive by employees. It could be perceived as excessive or authoritarian. And when it's perceived like that, it starts to become counterproductive for both parties over the longer term. What that signifies, if you think back to our definition of surveillance, information collection, etc., exercise of power, what this represents for people is maybe perhaps an abuse of power, an extension of power which is unwelcome, perhaps unfair, perhaps unethical. And then you start to get into bother with surveillance in the workplace. And this raises concerns for privacy, of course, it raises concerns for intrusiveness, but it also raises concerns for things like the equitable treatment of employees, their well-being, where the boundaries of their work and private lives sit. So an awful lot of issues are raised when this stuff starts to creep into some of these more personal places and spaces and feelings and thoughts. Right, so what do we know about its impact? I'm going to tell you now about the risks associated with it. There we are. And these are the findings. So we've got 40 years of knowledge on this. And this is what we know so far about how this stuff can really start to influence and affect people in the workplace. Right, so if we start with this notion of a perception of surveillance that perhaps we start to feel, okay, this is a bit invasive, it's starting to feel authoritarian, it's starting to feel like this is too much, it's excessive. Now, what the research tells us is there are 3 sets of factors which influence this feeling. The first is kind of a standard data protection type of explanation, which is around the purpose of surveillance. Is the purpose clear, or is it unclear? Is there one, or is it absent, or is it actually exceeded? And if we don't know that, if we feel any of these things, we can start to feel actually this surveillance, we don't really know why it's being done. It was perhaps implemented for one thing and is being used for something else. We call that function creep in surveillance studies. That can start, those feelings of invasiveness and those uneasiness around surveillance. The second set of factors is around supporting policy and how our actual surveillance practice unfolds. And what we know from the literature is that when we have unclear policy that is poorly explained, that people don't know how to exercise their rights under, they don't know where to go if there's a problem, we start to feel that surveillance is starting to become like an abuse of power. And again, if we are working with a manager who treats you like a machine, who doesn't treat you like a human being, and perhaps offers low social support, again, we can start to feel that the surveillance itself is a problem. And that's a particular issue in remote work or home working. It takes a very strong, high trust social relationship between managers and colleagues to actually make home working a success, particularly if you're using any form of monitoring. That's what the literature tells us. And then the third set of factors is about how the surveillance itself is configured. So if you have really intensive data collection, not just on the individual, but also on their team or their department, there's like a full 360 intensive data collection, that can feel quite intrusive on its own. If your surveillance is going deep into the personal characteristics rather than just the performance of the person, that can also feel invasive. If the person has no control over the onset of surveillance, and one of the examples this is like hardwired surveillance technology such as body-worn cameras that are just on all the time, if you have no discretion over whether you turn that on or not, that can feel very invasive. Also, whether you are able to self-report or not. So if you self-report, that's better than being under constant surveillance. And if you have no control over who sees the data, that can also feel invasive. So we've got these three sets of factors around the way that we implement surveillance and use it and communicate about it and configure it that can start to cause those perceptions of invasiveness. And the consequences are in this box here. Now, what the literature tells us, and this goes back a long way, is that there are negative consequences both for worker psychology and their experience of their own head, effectively, and their experience of the workplace around them, and also their experience of relationships with others. So the social side of work, we see risks on the psychological and social dimensions. So to look at the diagram there, on the psycho side, on the psychological side, if we are feeling that surveillance is perhaps too much, excessive, we can start to perceive things like the level of fairness and justice in the workplace more negatively. It affects our sense of job satisfaction. It affects the extent to which we can feel we can be creative in the workplace. It affects our commitment to the organisation. It affects our sense of autonomy, almost in self-determination in the workplace. And it can impact trust as well. It can really ruin trust in the workplace. We also see an increase in stress, and the very early studies of workplace surveillance were all about stress, and a breach in the psychological contract. Now, the psychological contract is the implied contract that we have with our employer when we go into work. It covers things like what we each expect of the other, the level of goodwill, the mode of communication, all those things that grease the wheels of the employment contract. We call that the psychological contract. You see there in that box on the left hand, the box at the bottom of the list, we have a two words, trait reactance. That's psychology language, and that refers to a personality characteristic that some people have in response to is a personality characteristic that will be triggered by surveillance. Someone who has high trait reactance is someone who gets quite angry quite quickly if they see something like an ethical breach that surveillance would kind of pose for them. If we move over to the social risks, how surveillance impacts our relationships with others, it can start to increase tension if we start to have that low social trust in the workplace. It can increase a thing called emotional labour. Now, emotional labour is the difference between our felt emotion and our expressed emotion, and how different those two are, and how we have to work to manage our expressed emotion when we're feeling something quite different. There is identity work, the extent to which we feel we have to modify our expressed identity in the workplace as opposed to our felt identity. There's issues around public-private boundary violations, particularly in the home, but also what information, what we create and that's visible about ourselves or not. So would we be okay with our emotions being analysed in the workplace? I'm not sure. That could be a public-private boundary violation. Organisational values that are based on control rather than other things, and of course resistance. So if we have a change in the power balance in the workplace, or a change in power relations in the workplace, because surveillance is starting to feel like an abuse of power, you will inevitably see greater resistance. That can mean an increase in quitting, and the oh my goodness, what they're called, sorry, I need to look at my notes here. Oh yes, the Morning Consult, which is a consultancy, did a survey recently of young workers, 50% of whom would quit if they were subject to surveillance. We maybe see a use of humour as coping, lower productivity through slacking, maybe increased sabotage. A new form of resistance recently, because of social media and so on, is what we call public denunciation of the employer, and of course collective action and strikes. And the United Technical and Allied Workers branch of the Communication Workers Union are really campaigning hard about workplace surveillance at the moment. So what are the business implications of this? So this is basically the whole of the research at the minute as it stands. I've tried to summarise it in a single slide. But what are the implications for businesses? What are the implications for health and safety? Now, interestingly, the European Union are all over this. So the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, as well as the Joint Research Council, are really busy surveying companies and surveying workers about the impact of monitoring on them. And really shockingly, OSHA found that, that's the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, surveyed quite a few companies who used monitoring, and they found that only 1 in 4 had considered the health and safety aspects. Now consider that in the light of the research findings. We see increased stress, perhaps, we see other sort of elements of an unhealthy workplace might be caused by monitoring. Only 1 in 4 had considered these. So the first thing is there a health and safety crisis about to emerge around monitoring? What are the legal liabilities? How are employers supposed to risk assess some of these technologies, which are now used on a more widespread and intensive basis, when we have known risks of using them for the mental health? And also OSHA are concerned with physical health as well in the workplace, but particularly mental health. We move across to the question of social responsibility as well. Quite a few of the NGOs at the minute, and people like the Royal Society of Arts, the Institute for the Future of Work, are concerned with the good work agenda. So how we promote work which is good quality, rewarding work, rather than machine-like work. And I've got a quote there from Public Health Scotland, who have weighed in on this, and they say that good work is work which prevents harm, ensuring a safe and healthy workplace. Physical work environment is safe, encourages productivity and prevents social isolation. The design of the job allows an element of autonomy and control, promotes good mental health and reduces stress. You can see it there. That good work balances power between employer and employer, encourages and supports good health, including work-life balance. So you can see that sits quite awkwardly alongside some of those findings about how we know poorly conducted surveillance in the workplace can negatively affect workers. If we go back to the Morning Consult findings, if you're doing it so badly that people are actually not willing to put up with it anymore, you lose half your workers. Well, that's a huge financial impact for the business. And we have consultancies such as Centric HR saying, well, it costs 16% of annual salary to replace a lower paid employee, 20% for a mid-level employee, 213% for an executive. So you don't really want to be losing people. And we also know that trust is a foundational element of a high performing organisation. There's a litany of research on this. So how can we approach it in a more principled way? Well, in the report that I'm talking about just now, I'm drawing on two sets of principles, which refer to fair data use, but also fairness in the organisation. Data justice and organisational justice. And data justice has 3 components. So the first is visibility. So that's how equitably we are represented in data. Engagement with technologies. So you can be both under and overrepresented depending on your community and where you are demographically. Engagement with technology is about how we're informed, understand and can exercise control over data processing, and actually how we can take advantage of it for ourselves. And non-discrimination, so that's how we govern and challenge bias in data processing. And some of you may be aware of things like algorithmic bias. It's debated at the minute. And organisational justice is all about the equality in outcomes of organising processes. That's what we call distributive justice. We have procedural justice, which is about the fairness of the process itself. Informational justice, which is about how fairly people are treated as information recipients. So do we have things explained to us in a language we understand, that's accessible, that is meaningful to us? And so the opposite of that would be your standard privacy policy, for example. And whether we're treated with dignity as individuals in interaction, and you don't need to sort of explain how we should not be abusive or discriminatory or whatever in our interactions. So in terms of monitoring, what kind of things should be implemented? Now, what I did, a little thought experiment where I combine these ethical principles. And so here's the first two. So visibility and distributive justice. So how equitably we're represented in data and what are the outcomes? So the inputs and the outcomes to data processing, how fair are they? And what happens is a number of questions arise about monitoring that we can pose to our monitoring practice. And I'll just go through some of these. So if we start at the top left, we can ask whether employees can gain any meaningful control over data collection on set, so they can control their visibility. Whether they can control their visibility by opting out of more invasive forms of monitoring without shame or social pressure. That's moving over to the right of the slide. Beneath that, we say, OK, well, if monitoring is used to determine outcomes, are they appropriate given the monitoring they've been subject to and the effort that they've put in? At the bottom of the slide, do we really have to monitor employees beyond performance? Again, controlling visibility. Do we have to look at reputation, emotions and things like that? Is that necessary? Is there equality in data processing for all employee groups? Is the processing that their data is subject to comparable in equitable terms? And do we target disproportionately certain groups with monitoring practice? So that's the first set of questions. The second set of questions, I'm going to talk about combining the idea of non-discrimination, so having processes which are free from bias, with procedural justice, i.e. fair processes which are open and that can be challenged. And just a few ideas come up here. Starting at the top left, are there mechanisms through which employee concerns can be heard? And not only that, moving to the top right of the slide, do employees and their representatives have a mechanism to challenge a decision which uses monitored data? What consultative mechanisms are there? To the bottom right, do we know whether there are any rules about how monitoring data can be interpreted, and are they consistently applied? And at the bottom left there, are we absolutely sure that we're not introducing any bias into our data interpretation? And then finally, I'm interested in looking at the combination of engagement with technology, how we can use it to help ourselves and being properly informed about it, with the organisational justice principles of informational justice and interactional justice. So we're here talking about their understanding and exercising control over monitoring, being treated with dignity, having their rights respected, and employees having skilled, considerate management support, which is the key, I have to say, to this. And we've got a few questions here. So we've got some questions about whether employees can turn off monitoring at the top left when they're in the time, space or territory which is outside working hours or outside the workplace, because we have this always on economy now, don't we? And then in the middle at the top, are employees trained in the monitoring policy? That goes back to the research findings. Are they trained in it, and are they empowered to exercise their rights under it at all times? And is this something that's taken seriously? Are employees consulted should the purpose of monitoring change, so that we can avoid these perceptions of excessive monitoring? My favourite one is whether actually you can involve employees in the co-design of monitoring processes so that it is fair from the start. And are monitored employees aware of what happens to the data? Moving to the bottom middle, can they control data sharing? Bottom left, are they trained in the use of their own data? Imagine if you could get hold of all your performance data and analyse and go, actually, no, I can see where my development path lies. That would be hugely empowering. And also, I've already mentioned this actually, the left-hand side of the slide, is there an option to use voluntary reporting instead of continuous monitoring? So that's some food for thought. And I'm just going to draw a few conclusions now before we can have a few questions. Okay, so what I hope I've demonstrated there is that when we look at employee monitoring, its impacts go beyond data use into things like health and safety, as well as fair and equitable treatment at work. And that detriment is now being recognised. We have a joint committee on human rights investigation, the human rights at work investigation, to which I've submitted this kind of argument I presented today as evidence. And the UK Information Commissioner's Office are also drafting guidance on employee monitoring, which is very, very helpful. And again, I've contributed to that. I will always argue for a principled approach with opportunities for good work facilitated if there is monitoring present. I will always argue for employee participation and involvement in the design and use of surveillance technologies, and there are European employment lawyers who are kind of on my side here. I will always argue for transparent health and safety risk assessments of surveillance technologies, and I'll concur also with some of the TUC's lawyers who've talked about applicable regulation, how it should be extended in the workplace, such as the Equality Act, a tighter definition of GDPR terminology around things like legitimate interest and business necessity, and an ECHR code for employers. That's the European Court of Human Rights. They're arguing for that too. And that, I think, is the end. I think I've done 35 minutes as promised, Alex. Just thanks everyone for listening to me talk for that long. That's our website, crispsurveillance.com. Crispserve is our Twitter handle. We've got so many events coming up. We've got body worn video this week. We've got an event on the online safety bill in Coventry on the 26th. We've got our annual lecture, which is about sustainability and privacy and surveillance, on the 27th of April at the LSE. So London people, please come down to that and register on our website. And we have our biannual doctoral training school on the 19th of June, as well as our book series. So yeah, and that URL at the bottom is my report on electronic surveillance in the workplace, but you can also get to that through the website. So yeah, that's me. Thanks for listening, everyone. Back to you, Alex. Hopefully got some questions there.
Kirstie, thank you very much. It's absolutely fascinating area. We've already got a couple of really good questions come in, which I'll share in a second. I just before we get to them, I wanted to ask one really basic question, just to kind of put us in the picture. Which of the sectors where electronic workplace surveillance is most prevalent?
So that's the interesting thing at the moment. For years and years, it was always logistics, contact centres, gambling, and I think there was another one in my head, but I've forgotten. But those always were the three main ones. What's really interesting is that now it's started to spread across things like the professions, academia, things like dentistry, health, education, as well as kind of all manner of kind of tech workplaces. And we also have, let's not forget, the platform economy as well. So this is a huge the last 5 to 10 years, gig work and platform work is entirely facilitated by algorithmic management, and these are massive data corporations. So basically we see it everywhere now, and understanding how that is configured and where those intensities are across the piece through different countries is some of the work that the Joint Research Council is doing, the Joint Research Council of the European Union. The research that I did in that report that I've mentioned quite a few times, we also produced a questionnaire which has been implemented in a multi-country study of employee surveillance kind of intensities and different focuses, and we'll look at the professions, we look at different levels and hierarchies of job that are being surveilled now, and I have access to the data set. All I need is a willing statistician.
Okay, well, there you go.
I know of a couple.
Get in touch if you're a willing statistician. And great. Well, look, I've got questions stacking up here, so let's. But that's great. That sort of puts us in the picture in terms of what's out there. So, first question from Anonymous, obviously
Cool.
worried about being surveilled.
Hi, Anonymous.
Should monitoring productivity be mandatory to balance any of the other measurements and techniques you've described that could help proportionate measurements of other metrics? If productivity is good or great, is any surveillance justifiable?
Good question. So just let me repeat that to ensure that I've understood it. So if productivity is already good, do you need surveillance?
Yeah, I guess. Well, what's the
question?
justification if you know your productivity is already good?
Okay. Oh, there's lots to say to that one. So we start with the reasons why an organisation would surveil. So I set those out as being understanding resource use, managing commercial confidentiality, and also managing legal liability around crime. So depending on how work is done, some of that will always be necessary. But if your productivity is always good, like hopefully you have a high trust workplace, a high performing workplace where you've got competent managers understanding what makes their employees tick and creating, healthy team working environments and giving feedback which is developmental and understanding and caring and enabling, as opposed to clamping down using different types of very exacting surveillance technology. You may use surveillance technology, but you may use it in a way which people self-report rather than are under constant monitoring. So if you would rather go for a high trust approach without monitoring, then that's cool. Do it. You don't necessarily need surveillance. I mean, I know of organisations that do that, and some of them are global.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but hopefully you'll have a really lovely workplace if you don't have to do that.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. So next one is a question from Sandro Eich.
Oh, hi, Sandro.
Who says, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation, Kirstie. Would you be able to say a little bit more about how your conceptualization of employee surveillance sits with new work, particularly flexible working and working from home? And that was something that very much occurred to me as you were speaking, that there seems to me to be an inherent and huge kind of tension and contradiction between the new flexibility post-pandemic and the ability and perhaps willingness of employers to surveil. Yeah.
That's a lovely question, Sandro. Thank you for that one. So that is actually a chapter in the report as well. And what I was informed by there was the 20-odd year history of research into teleworking and remote working. There's a sort of a separate sort of body of literature around that. And whilst none of it really looks at surveillance per se, what we do know from that literature is that if you are going to monitor home workers or teleworkers, then do not monitor process. Do not monitor outcome. So if you monitor outcome, then you will allow that person to have autonomy and flexibility as to how they reach that outcome. And moreover, what is really crucial is during that process, it needs to be supported socially. High trust relationship management and high trust social relationships are what make flexible and remote working work for people. It has to be that, and that's what the teleworking literature tells us. And so you can't get away from, with any of the debates around surveillance and how we use it, you cannot get away from the added value brought by high quality people skills, empathy, emotional intelligence, all of those things that enable those high trust working relationships. Is that helpful?
Yes, that sounds good to me. So yeah, so it's outcomes, not process.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So next question is from Helen, who says the Health and Care Staffing Scotland Act 2019, due to be enacted April 2024, brings staff wellbeing into primary legislation for those working in health and social care. I wonder what your thoughts are, especially given the increase in technology used to record outcomes for people in social care, which also records staff activity.
Yeah, I've got colleagues who work on this actually. I'm not in social care myself. I don't work on this area, but I know of the huge pressures that health workers and social care workers are put under, particularly in relation to their time, the time with which they can spend with clients, the time with which they are driving and moving between clients, and that is subject to electronic monitoring. I understand that is extremely stressful and compromising, and I also understand for workers, and I also understand that there actually have been a couple of studies now that's just brought that back actually. That in many ways a lot of the care workers in the studies that I know about were actually resisting the surveillance because it meant that the quality of care that they were providing was compromised, as well as their well-being and as well as their sort of job satisfaction. And so I would welcome any kind of review of, first of all, the literatures that I know about here, but also to engage people who work in the caring profession around some of these very heavily timed roles. Would you mind just repeating the question again, just to make sure I've answered it, Alex? Because I'm kind of talking around it at the minute. Sorry.
Sure. So the question is, the Health and Care Staffing Scotland Act 2019 brings staff wellbeing into primary legislation for those working in health and social care. I wonder what your thoughts are, especially given the increasing technology used to record outcomes for people. So, I mean, it's essentially, how do you think that's going to impact on that sector and people working in that sector?
I would welcome the opportunity to make that sector aware of what's happening and what the evidence base is around what the impact of surveillance can be and is on people who are like subject to this very heavy time-based monitoring of care work. I mean, I could probably predict what people would think about it, and I could probably suggest that a degree of autonomy, flexibility, and professional accreditation, or acknowledging the professionalism of these people and the quality of care needs to actually come first before this bizarre time-based monitoring that some of the care workers are now subject to, that I'm understanding is the case. But if that's the conversation that's happening, I'd really want to join it. So.
Okay, thank you.
And I just commend. So I want to commend the work of my colleague, Dr. Alina Baluch, who works in the School of Management, and she's actually working directly on this.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'm seeing 7 questions. We got 14 minutes, so
that's one every 2 minutes. Okay,
we can do the math. That's the Americans would say. So next one. What does the law say? This is from Anonymous. What does the law say regarding employers holding data relating to employees that have left their posts?
You've asked me a legal question.
It is a legal question.
Yeah,
it is a legal question.
I can't answer that, but I think probably there will be a time limit on. There will be a legal time limit on how long an employer can use those data, because within the data protection principles there is provision for it's not purpose limitation. There is a provision for time limit, and you can't keep the data any longer than necessary. So I would have thought, not being legally qualified, but if once an employee has left their employment, the contract is now no longer working, the employment contract is finished, I would assume that would need to be deleted. But to ask an employment lawyer, I think, okay. and someone who's legally qualified in, legally qualified.
Disclaimer, fully heard. Okay, next one, also anonymous. This is an easy one. How do I register for the body-worn cameras in policing lecture?
It's have you looked at the CRISP websites? Have you looked at our events?
So I think you go to the CRISP website, basically.
Yeah, so it's in our events blog, and if you want to email crisp@stir.ac.uk, that's stir.ac.uk. It's William, our director at Stirling, is organising that one. But the thing is, I'm speaking at that event on Thursday about the electronic monitoring implications of body-worn cameras, so you will have mostly heard it if you go. But there's lots of other interesting people speaking as well.
Thank you. Question from Tom Montgomery. Thanks for the excellent discussion. Is there any evidence in the literature you are aware of regarding a connection between the extent and nature of workplace surveillance and the union density in a workplace or sector?
No, there's nothing that I know about no, there isn't any connection between workplace surveillance and union density. I know that the unions are picking up on workplace surveillance. The TUC has a campaign on it. The Communications Workers Union also has a campaign because I've advised them. But in terms of research, no, I don't believe there is any on that one. Are you doing a PhD on it or something? I'm a really cool PhD if you want us to do it.
Another one from Anonymous. Could gig economy style monitoring be deployed in the NHS to better use resources?
I bloody hope not. Sorry. Could it be deployed in the NHS to better monitor resource use? Do you mean physical resource? Do you mean actual people? Because I mean, gig economy style.
I mean, I'm presuming that if you're talking about gig economy style, you are talking about kind of it's people, isn't it?
I'm going to say that would probably be quite difficult to implement. I don't know if the questioner is from the NHS or not, but there is the NHS IT change kind of thing is something that is bedeviled with legacy systems, and you remember the NHS spine in England and Wales and what happened there. I know Scotland is organised differently. I'm